Hello, and welcome to your third, final, and hopefully shortest module of Chapter 9. So I had started to record this right after I finished the first two, and for some reason PowerPoint decided to freeze up on me and I lost what I had, so I'm going to start over again. So this module, 9.3, is going to talk about some of the different influences on intelligence, so biological, environmental, and behavioral influences. So far we talked about measuring intelligence, we talked about defining intelligence, but this is basically just saying, what can influence intelligence levels. And as with pretty much anything else in psychology, we see that it's never just one or the other, it's never just nature or nurture, it's always some combination of the both. So in this module we'll talk a bit about some of those biological, environmental, and behavioral influences on intelligence. So with respect to some of the biological influences on intelligence, one of the first things that people kind of thought to study when they thought about our biology and our level of intelligence was the size of the brain, or the physical structure of the brain. So people asked, does the physical structure of our brain hold the secret to genius? Does that have anything to do with our level of intelligence? And a doctor named Thomas Harvey thought that it might. So after Albert Einstein, who, as you know, is widely regarded as a very intelligent man, some would say a genius, once he passed away in 1955, Dr. Harvey studied Einstein's brain and surprisingly concluded that it wasn't very remarkable at all. Honestly, the only major distinctions he noticed at that point were that it was actually slightly smaller than average. But suddenly, Einstein's brain went missing. So you would think that in the case of someone like Einstein, his brain would be studied very extensively. And Harvey was given the brain and had kind of dissected it and taken cross sections and things. And then the brain went missing for 22 years. And 22 years later, there was actually a journalist who visited Dr. Harvey, and he was basically looking for Einstein's brain, and when he asked the doctor about it, the doctor sheepishly pulled out a box from kind of a cabinet in his office labeled cider, and it actually contained the jars with the remnants of Einstein's brain. So kind of not something you need to remember, but just kind of like a funny fact, a fun story. Basically, Einstein's brain was missing for 22 years. And when they did find it, because there had been kind of improvements to technology and things over that time, we have now been able to discover that Einstein's brain did have several important abnormalities in things like the parietal, the temporal, and the frontal lobes, and it contained some extra folds and convolutions as well, so greater surface area with respect to the brain folds. So this research shows us once again that our behaviors and abilities are linked to our biology. So now we'll talk a bit about a different type of biological influence, which is genetics. So if you were in my class last semester, or even if you weren't and you took 160 at some point, you probably remember talking about heritability and heritability estimates, meaning basically the amount of variance in a trait that can be explained by genetic influences. So decades of research on twins and children who have been adopted has shown that genetic similarity does contribute to intelligence scores. So if you remember when we talked about heritability in that course, it is basically studied in two different ways. We can either look at twins, identical twins who are raised apart and compare them to each other, or compare identical twins and their similarities to fraternal twins. And you can also compare children to both their adoptive parents and their biological parents. And so what we see using these studies for estimates of heritability is that as the degree of genetic relatedness increases, so does similarity in our IQ scores. So there seems to be a correlation of about 0.85 for identical twins. And if you remember talking about correlations in 160, a correlation of 0.85 is actually extremely high. So very rarely are you going to get a correlation that's exactly kind of a 1, but a 0.85 is one of the strongest that you'll see. So very strong genetic influence on intelligence for sure. Overall, the heritability of intelligence is estimated to be between 40 and 80%, which again, that upper range is quite high. That means that the majority of variance would be explained by genetics rather than by the environment. However, we do need to remember that heritability is specific to differences between people within a sample. So when we're looking at a certain set of individuals and we decide to estimate heritability within that sample, we can't then take that estimate and apply it to other people. It doesn't work that way. So it could be that intelligence seems to be about 72% heritable for one group, but only about 10% for another. It really does depend a lot on the environmental influences as well. There are also several problems with assuming that these estimates mean that genes cause the differences in intelligence, because as we know, and as I've mentioned over and over again, correlation does not equal causation. So just because there's relatedness there, there's a relationship, doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other. It may be indirect, or it may be due to interactions with the environment as well. So here's a little diagram that kind of takes you through some of the different relationships in terms of genetic relatedness and the correlations for intelligence for each. So you can see if you're looking at the adopted siblings or kind of parents and offspring, these first few columns here, they're not particularly high estimates, but when you get up to monozygotic twins, which are identical twins, you see that even those reared apart are a lot more similar in their intelligence scores than fraternal twins would be. So that's a very powerful kind of example of how strong that genetic influence is. And for identical twins raised together, those are the highest estimates that we can see. So definitely something to kind of keep in mind when you're discussing intelligence, is that it is something that seemed to be highly heritable. So now I just want to talk briefly about behavioral genomics. I know it's something that's kind of confusing, but just to touch on it. While it is clear that some of this difference that we see in intelligence scores can be attributed to genetic factors, this doesn't tell us which genes account for them. So just because we know there's a high genetic influence doesn't tell us what genes are actually exerting that influence. So for that, we use a type of study called behavioral genomics. So that's a technique that examines how specific genes interact with the environment in order to influence our behavior. It has actually been shown that intelligence can be predicted to some degree by a collection of genes that an individual inherits, but there is still a long way to go in terms of kind of really trying to tease out those relationships and look at what specific genes might be related to what specific aspects of intelligence. So this research has been aided by the use of what we call gene knockout studies, which is kind of interesting. They literally remove a specific gene and then they compare the characteristics of animals with and without that gene. Obviously, we're using animals for this research. We can't just knock out genes in humans, but you are able to kind of observe the differences between an animal that has that gene intact and one that's had it removed. Scientists at times also take an opposite approach to that, and instead of removing a gene, they will actually add something in. So they can create transgenic animals. And that's actually been used to create kind of a strain, I guess you would call it, of mice who seem to learn a lot faster than average. They call them Doogie Howser mice after a really old TV show that I've actually never seen, but I've heard of. It involves Neil Patrick Harris as a kid, and basically he's like super intelligent and becomes a doctor at a very young age. So they basically named these mice after him because they were able to learn a lot more quickly than their peers. So now I want to talk briefly about brain size and intelligence. So we did talk a bit about the structure right at the beginning, but some might ask the general question of, are people who have bigger brains more intelligent? Your text studies this question using the scientific literacy model, so you can take a look at that if you want to kind of go through their logic and the evidence that they've accrued. But basically the synopsis is that many early studies were highly flawed. They tended to conclude that Caucasian males had the largest brains and were therefore the smartest of the human race. But again, highlighting that they were definitely highly flawed. And so a researcher at McMaster University collected 100 brains of deceased individuals who had completed the WISE, that Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale we talked about in the last module. And it was found that for women and right-handed men, the size of the brain accounted for 36% of the variation in verbal intelligence score, but none for visuospatial abilities. So there was a, kind of a weak relationship in terms of the verbal intelligence and none at all for the visuospatial abilities. Other features of the brain, so not just the size itself, such as the number and size of the cerebral gyri, or those little kind of convolutions in the brain, they appear to be more strongly related to intelligence. But we still must be wary of these results because it's not always clear what's being measured. Of course, we have to kind of watch out for that third variable problem, if there's a third factor that could be influencing both in a correlational relationship. And overall, it seems to be that brain size would only predict about 25%, if we kind of average it out, of the amount of variance in intelligence. So what about that other 75%? So I mean, even though it does maybe predict a portion, that's still a very small amount compared to the overall. So this is just a little diagram that kind of illustrates what I'm talking about with the cerebral gyri. So basically, even though we see only a modest relationship at best between brain size and intelligence, we do see that having increased convolutions is associated with higher intelligence test scores, because the more convolutions you have in your brain matter, the more surface area you have for kind of interactions to occur within the brain. Now let's talk a little about some environmental influences on intelligence. So not only can environment influence which genes get expressed, which is something we talked about back in our biological psychology chapter, but the brain areas involved in intelligence are responsive to a variety of environmental factors as well. So growing up in what we would call a physically and socially stimulating environment has been shown to result in faster learning as well as enhanced brain development. So literally people who grow up in kind of an enriched environment actually tend to have more synapses, more connections between the neurons in their nervous system. Birth order is also something that has been reported to affect intelligence. We do typically see the IQ scores of firstborn children are on average about 3 or 4 points higher than those of other children, but this may be due to tutoring and mentoring younger siblings as well, because obviously if you are the firstborn child, especially in a larger family, you're probably spending a fair amount of time helping your younger siblings with their homework, and as you've probably heard before, teaching something is really the best way to learn it yourself. So it makes sense that maybe those type of activities could contribute to their overall intelligence. One of the most well-supported findings in intelligence literature is that IQ correlates strongly with socioeconomic status. If you have greater SES or socioeconomic status, it means you have greater access to opportunities and resources, and a lot of the time that can either directly or indirectly lead to increased IQ levels. So for example, some of the things that higher SES has been associated with may be kind of the reasons that it seems to have a relationship with intelligence. So higher SES has been associated with more enriching and supportive home environments for intellectual development, and it interacts with a number of other factors such as level of nutrition. Obviously, if you have more money to spend, you're more likely to be able to afford, healthier food and things like that. People who have higher SES tend to have lower levels of stress in general, because they're not worried as much about their next meal or about losing their home. And then quality of education as well. So those who are of a higher socioeconomic status and kind of live in the better neighborhoods, it kind of goes along with that they a lot of the time get to go to the better schools as well. And so the quality of education may be higher in general as well. So there is definitely a relationship there between SES and intelligence, but it seems to be maybe not directly related to SES as much as it is related to a lot of the associated factors. There is actually evidence to suggest that poor nutrition could have negative effects on intelligence. We do see that diets that are high in saturated fats versus those that are higher in produce, fish, and whole grains, the saturated fats tend to kind of be associated with those lower levels of intelligence. Like it can seemingly affect level of intelligence, which makes sense because if you're not getting the nutrients your body needs, it's going to be a lot harder for you to kind of react in an intelligent way to things. Levels of stress can also affect intelligence. So higher amounts of stress hormones such as cortisol can interfere with working memory and ability to persevere. So we'll talk a bit later in this course. Actually, we have a whole chapter on stress coping and health, and we'll talk a bit more about stress reactions, stress hormones, and how they can be very influential in terms of impacting your functioning in a variety of ways. Finally, the quality and level of education can play a very important role in intelligence. So children's IQ scores are significantly lower if they do not attend school, and for most children, IQ scores actually drop over the summer holidays. simply because, they're not really being engaged in a lot of that intellectual activity. So having that quality education and also having, extracurricular activities and things that can kind of keep you thinking, even when you're not necessarily at school, those things can be really impactful as well on kind of perceived level of intelligence. And finally, I want to talk to you about something called the Flynn effect. You may have heard of this before. So basically, it refers to the steady population level increase in intelligence test scores over time. So from 1932 to 2007, it actually seems as though the IQ scores rose about 1 point every 3 years. So on average, our IQ scores have been increasing over time. So the question you might ask is, how do we explain this increase? What does that mean? So one of the proposed, obviously we don't know for sure, but one of the proposed mechanisms would be that modern society requires certain types of intellectual skills, such as abstract thinking, scientific reasoning, classification, and logical analysis. And so basically each successive generation ends up spending more time manipulating information with their minds. So engaging in working memory tasks and kind of really using a lot of sections of the brain that may not have necessarily gotten a lot of use in previous generations. So therefore, it seems likely that these shifts in information processing led to that increase in IQ scores over time. Here's a little diagram that kind of shows you that Flynn effect. So we can see that over time in all 4 of the countries that are kind of pictured here, or 5, sorry, we do see, a trend in terms of increasing IQ in the average IQ over time. And then finally, I know I just said finally, I forgot that this little slide was in here. I'm not going to spend much time on it, and I don't expect you to really know a lot about it, but I want to talk a bit about some of the behavioral influences on intelligence. So brain training programs have become very popular. I'm sure you've all seen the commercials for them on Facebook, on TV. It's, do this activity for 10 minutes a day and it helps keep your brain young. And so research into their effects initially appeared promising. It did seem like they were having a positive impact, but recent reviews have shown that we should still be cautious when interpreting these results. So the effects tend to be quite limited, kind of to the specific activity that it's helping you practice with. They don't tend to generalize. So nootropic drugs are substances that are believed to beneficially affect intelligence. They work through many different types of mechanisms, so it could be increased arousal or neurotransmitter availability, or even stimulating nerve growth within the brain. So there are a lot of different mechanisms by which these drugs take hold, but it has been shown that they do really seem to work for some people. So these types of drugs include things like Ritalin or Provigil, some of the drugs that are commonly prescribed for conditions like ADD or ADHD. And yeah, they certainly do seem to work for many people, but unfortunately boosting the brain does not come without risk. So there can be long-term side effects and dependency issues and things like that you want to watch out for. So in sum, we've seen a bunch of things that are related to intelligence, and there are many practical things that we can do to kind of help safely try to boost our brain power and improve our intelligence as best we can. So things like eating better, as we mentioned, the nutrition is a very big factor. Engaging in enriching environments where possible. Taking extra curricular activities and kind of trying to place yourself in situations where you are learning and you're kind of trying new things. Those types of things can kind of help boost brain power naturally and may have less harmful side effects than maybe some of the drugs and things that are used at times. That is it for Chapter 9. So hopefully you enjoyed the lectures. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I will be starting Chapter 10 for the next class. So basically we'll have 3 days. We'll have a Friday, a Monday, and a Wednesday for this chapter, and then the next Friday we'll be starting Chapter 10. But by all means, if you still have questions about Chapter 9, feel free to either email me or pop on during the class time in our Moodle chat room and ask me any questions you might have. And then we will, before the first test, after we finish Chapter 10, we will still have that big Zoom review and kind of go through everything that we've learned so far and what the most important things are to keep in mind. So thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.